It's really a pleasure to be with you, and I'm really pleased that the formation team felt that this aspect was important enough to have some discussion about. And I said, well, Sandy, what would you like me to cover? Past, present, future of ministry to the African American community. And I thought, but then I thought, well, what I can do, it's my perspective. And also, she asked if I would share some of my own experiences. So this isn't like an ego trip, but this was what she had encouraged me to do. So what I would like to do is give kind of like an overview. And if you would like to jot down questions or whatever, because it is informal, but I think it might be helpful for me to go through the points that I have. And really, I cannot cover everything, and you will have things I hope that you could share. But, and then I have a little show and tell at the end. If you would like, some of you may be not familiar with the old habit and things like that, or maybe you weren't even born in '65 when all was going on down in Selma, Alabama. But let's just take a minute to just kind of quiet ourselves. Now, I will be using the terms colored, Negro, Black, African American, in the perspectives in which the time period was. And maybe you've heard that saying, well, what do they want to be called, or what do you want to be called? I know how I identify, but there are others of color, and some people don't even like that term, but I'm very comfortable with it, of color, who do prefer Black or African American or even some Negro. But that's what I came across in my research in preparing this presentation. So you will hear that term. Those are the non-derogatory terms. There are all kinds of derogatory terms which really are still surfacing. And you're aware of that in light of what's going on in our country today. Now, I was surprised when our sisters first arrived in New Orleans in 1836. That was the first time that they saw colored children. And my understanding was they were fascinated with them. When they get up to Rondelet in 1845, they did open a school for colored girls. It's mainly girls that came to the school. Some of the people in the area were not comfortable with that at all, and they were very negative. And this one night, a crowd, and I understand there were all men in this particular crowd, came up to the convent, and they were cursing and making all kinds of uproar, and the police had to come to dispel them. But my understanding is they came back several times that night. Now I don't know if you are familiar with Spirited Lives or not. I could have sworn I read someplace, but maybe it's only folklore. But the Mother Superior stood out on the front porch with a shotgun to scare the people away. I had heard that. So she was protecting the dear children. Well, the mayor decided that it was too dangerous for them to continue the school in light of the uproar that was going on in the community. And then Bishop, let's see what his name was, he decided it would be better to close the school. Bishop Kendrick, you've heard of Kendrick Seminary, that's here in the area. So it was only open about a year before they did close the school. Now, through the years, and my focus is mainly the St. Louis province, because that's with which I am more familiar. We've had ministries throughout the congregation to African Americans. And several schools were started which were serving Caucasians. But with changes in the neighborhood and demographics, a lot of those neighborhoods changed, the schools turned over, and they became more African American as the neighborhoods changed. But the sisters stayed there for a while, and then more and more they began to disperse throughout other areas of education. Now, there was a school called St. Joseph High School for the Color, and it was founded in 1937, and it was right on Page and Whittier. And that may not mean anything to those of you who are not from this area, but I'm a convert to Catholicism, and when I was baptized, right on the corner of Page and Whittier was St. Anne Catholic Church, and that's where I was baptized. And the high school was right next door. This was in December of my 8th grade. And so when it was time for me to graduate from grade school, I asked Mother, I said, I would like to go to Rosani Kane. Don't ask me, I don't even know how I even heard of Rosani Kane, but that was something I wanted to go to Rosani Kane. Well, it's a diocesan all-girls school. And my mother said, no, I do not want you going to an all-girls school. I would prefer that you go to a co-ed school. You will go to St. Joseph. Well, we had a very outstanding Archbishop here in St. Louis, whom I consider a saint. Maybe you've heard of him, Cardinal Ritter. He had been in Indianapolis when he came to St. Louis, and this was way back in '47. He desegregated all of the Catholic institutions to the consternation of many clergy as well as religious, not to mention the lay people. He was based at the cathedral, which is the Basilica on Lindell and Newstead, which is right across the street from Rosani Kane. And several of the parishioners said, hey, what do you do when you want to, and this is German people's change, they would take their money away.
Oh, yeah.
He said, if that's the case, we will get along fine without their finances. So it took from 47 to 51 for St. Joseph to close because of the declining enrollment there. I graduated in June of '51. So God had other plans for me. Even though the Sisters of St. Joseph were at St. Joseph Catholic High School, they were also at Rosani Kane. I ended up being able to go to Rosani Kane, where we had the Sisters of St. Joseph as well as the School Sisters of Notre Dame. And from there, I won't go into all the details, but I was the first African American to enter the congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet in '55. Now, my understanding was that Mother Killian at the time said, it is about time. Now, my senior religion teacher, Sister Rosa Smith, there are other things. I was very active with the Helpers of the Holy Souls. I did a lot, taught catechism. I was very active, Girl Scouts, the whole thing. But in our senior year, we had a field trip here to Carondelet. And it happened to have been probably in April or May. And the sisters at that time received the habit, the postulates, in March. So they were new and they were so welcoming. They seemed so happy. We were walking around the grounds. It was a beautiful day up on the banks of the Mississippi and whatever. And it was something about my experience here that really warmed my heart. Now, just between you and me, we did go to Repa also, which is the Sisters of Notre Dame. But it was a whole different experience for me. It was just different. And even though they had someone singing a jazz song and all of that, I used to go to Teen Town. And it happened to have been that evening at St. Anne. And I could dance. That was one thing I could do. I was spraying all over the boys. I was just distracted. Well, anyway, one thing led to the other. And one day, Sister Rose Cecilia came up to me and she said, Barbara, did you ever think about entering the convent? And I said, yes, I And during that Lent, we had been encouraged by the priest that taught us religion. He said, why don't you go to Mass every day during Lent to find out what God is calling you to do? And I did. So here I am. And then the year after that, there was another sister who entered, African American, but for whatever reason, she did not make her final profession. There are 2 African American sisters in the LA province. There's one in St. Paul. There were 2, but Imani died. And there is one, Clementine, in New York. Sister Gail Trippett is a member of the St. Louis province, and her ministry is now in Montgomery, Alabama. And she's a wonderful educator. She had been here for many years, but that's us. And I would like to share experiences for me that demonstrated the commitment of the Sisters of St. Joseph to justice and racial equality. In 1965, you're all familiar with what was going on in the South, and particularly in Alabama with voter registration. Now, Sister Joan Marie Gleason, may she rest in peace, whom I dearly love, was our provincial superior at the time. And there was a delegation, it was right after Bloody Sunday, and there were pictures in the paper and all over the television where the demonstrators were trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And literally, the state troopers and the police dogs and the water hoses and beatings and all of that was going on. So a call went out for the National Catholic Interracial Council for people of various ethnicities and also of different faiths to come. And they particularly wanted religious, because at that time we were in the habit, and the clergy. And there was a delegation going from Kansas City, and Sister Joan Marie asked if I would like to go. And I said, well, yes, I didn't know what else to get into. But anyway, I went. And if you would like me to share more in depth as we go along, at the end, I will go back. But I would just like to highlight some of the things that happened during my time there. The whole experience it profoundly changed my life. When we arrived, women, children, people of different ethnicities and races, habits and whatever, it was just so moving to see this delegation of people who were literally putting their lives on the line, because we know that some people were actually killed. And all of this, there were 22 of us that went from Kansas City. Several women religious congregations, priests, one Presbyterian minister, and an African American woman who was a Presbyterian. And when we arrived, there were all kinds of, demonstrations and singing and carrying on. But a lot of the strategy that took place for nonviolence took place in the basement of Brown Chapel. And people who led the movement, many of them were ministers. And still today, they are still involved in civil rights. But Martin Luther King Jr. was not there because they feared for his life at that time because of all that violence that had occurred. So he went back to Atlanta, but all the lieutenants were there. And that was what they called them. And they had their uniform. They had these coveralls. And we had a strategy. And they told us how we were to be with each other. And they warned the Presbyterian woman, I can't remember her name, and me, because in that particular setting, we were the ones, the outsiders, and we were the only African American people there. And she said, they said, now if you are arrested, you will be in a separate jail. And in light of that, do you still want to march? Yes. But they said, the nonviolent strategy, how we were to be together, arms linked, and no matter what happened, you were not to fight back. You were not to retaliate. And I remember this one young man, he said, well, what if you feel you just can't not fight back? And they said, you do not march. So here we were. Now we marched to the courthouse when I was there. So we had our arms linked and whatever. And literally, eyeball to eyeball with the state troopers in full riot gear. And that was frightening. We were not attacked at that time. We did not, none from our delegation ended up going to jail. However, some of the priests, we were, and it was wonderful, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester, they were ministering at Good Samaritan Hospital. And that's where several of us stayed. The priests stayed with the Edmondites, who were just right down the street. And some of them were chased, but they made it back to the rectory in time. Because if they had been caught, they probably would have been killed. Now, Archbishop Tulin, may he rest in peace, he was Mobile, Birmingham diocese. He forbade the priests or the sisters from that area to participate in any of the marches or demonstrations because he feared the reaction of the white Catholic in the area, the retaliation from them. So they were not to participate. But the sisters were able to host us. They cared for the people who were brought into the emergency room who were beaten. Father Ouellette, who just recently died, who was the saint, he was the one who was in the emergency room when John Lewis was brought in, half dead, who is now a congressman in D.C. And Father Ouellette said, I don't even see how he really survived. He was beaten so bad. And I have just a little column here. Well, it's going to be this Saturday, but usually the first Saturday of the month here in St. Louis, they have a big kickoff for the Martin Luther King celebration, and they bring in speakers. And a couple of years ago, they had John Lewis here. And Sister Teresa Cavalli, some of you might remember her, she is now on the Providence leadership team in LA. She was on congregational leadership at the time, and I went down. And of course, he was wonderful. I think he's a saint because he's not, doesn't hold any grudges, doesn't blame and all of this. But he was coming out, and of course, the entourage and the police were with him and tagging along. And I wanted to say hello to him because I had seen him, but I had not met him. So we were running after. I was dragging Teresa literally because I'm kind of, I wouldn't say aggressive, but assertive. So we kept saying, and then we asked the police officer, we said, can we say hello to the congressman? We were in Selma. And he said, well, I'm not, you have to talk to, I guess it was the state troopers who were further up. Well, Congressman Lewis heard all this commotion and he turned around and looked. I said, we were in Selma. Well, he hugged her. He hugged me. He hugged her. He hugged me. He was just so overwhelmed. And he asked about that priest. He remembered him. Now, this was just a couple of years ago. This was back in '65. And at that time, Father Ouellette was still alive. And I had recently seen him when I was in Selma, so I could update him. But that was a very moving experience for me. And his wife, Congressman Lewis's wife, just recently died, so you might remember her in your prayers. And when I did come back, I had the opportunity to speak to many groups. I was interviewed by several, newsletters and newspapers and all of this. And people were generally supportive and very helpful. But there were some who were not supportive at all because they did not feel that the sisters or the priest should be involved in this kind of demonstration and whatever. And very negative and whatever. Now, there was a delegation that went from St. Louis, and that's the famous picture because we went on the weekend. Sister Antona Ebo, when people see that picture, they put 2 and 2 together and get 5. They think I'm Sister Antona because she's a black sister. She was with Sister Rosemary Flanagan, who's now in Kansas City, and Sister Roberta Smith, who is now in Florida. They were bond faculty members at the time. And they were in the delegation that went from St. Louis. So that was wonderful. And I would like to say, I've returned to Selma many times. I went back for the 35th anniversary and the 40th anniversary. And it's wonderful to see all the changes. Still a lot of challenges there. And a little bit later, I'll share we do have sisters in ministry in the area. But the other example of the leadership, which I feel is demonstrated by the sisters, Sister Jo Marie at the time. The first Black Sisters Conference was held in 1968 in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. Again, I received a call from Sister Jo Marie, and she said, she encouraged me to go. But she said, would you like to go? And I said, yes. Well, it was a very moving experience for me because this was the first time I had been. They had many black priests there, brothers and sisters from other congregations. It was the first time that I had been with this large number of women religious and priests who were African American. And of course, the prayer services, the liturgies were very soulful. And it was very moving for me. But I did find out that some of the sisters later, because I was still a member of the Black Sisters Conference, the letters went to the superiors. They were forbidden to go. They couldn't go. I don't know what the fear was, but they were not allowed to go. And others, they were told they had to go. So you see the difference. I was asked if I would like to go and encouraged to go. But they were told either one way or the other they could or they couldn't. Well, the first session in '68 was only for African Americans. And there were Caucasians who came who had been involved in the black community. And it was kind of difficult, but they were told no, they could not participate. The next year, they did open it up to Caucasians. Sister Jo Marie and Sister Margaret Collins, who was from Albany, the two of them came. And those of you who are familiar, the rhetoric in the 60s and 70s was very militant. Things were very hot. And some of the speakers did not mince any words, stating their concerns and what all was going on with African Americans. Most of the Caucasians who were there were gone by the second day. I remember that. Sister Jo Marie and Sister Margaret Collins stayed to the bitter end. And that really said a lot to me. And I really just felt so strongly about that. But that was a powerful witness that they stayed because it was very difficult. Now, on another note, this is in light of ministries to African Americans, and I see Sister Pat Quinn sitting here. In April 1970, a resolution was unanimously passed by the Province Assembly that priority would be given to services among African Americans and in the black community. And this meant financially as well as personnel. Your sister's going in that. You were in Indianapolis at the time.
Yes.
It was at Holy Angel. And the sister, the letters on file in the archives, May of that year, they didn't waste any time after they got back from the assembly, requesting funds for what they would like to do, because they had people in the school who had special needs as far as cognitive learning and that. And Pat Quinn's name is on the letter that was signed by the sisters who were there. Now, presently, our congregational chapter called us to a deepening of communion with creation, with and within the church, with your neighbor, and with each other. And in relationship to the African American community, and I hope I don't leave out anybody, but I will highlight a few points. It is the expectation, and always has been, we have sponsorship agreements with our sponsor institutions. And in that sponsorship agreement is the expectation that, of course, you would serve the dear neighbor without distinction. But also there is the added encouragement that the administration, the board, and the staff be inclusive and diverse. And annually there is accounting for that sponsorship agreement. Well, in the plus 50 years I've been around, that is still a challenge for our sponsor institutions. For several of them, there have been many inroads made, but it's still a challenge. I have made more lists than I ever want to even think about, because they don't know what people of color, not just African Americans, but Asian community, Hispanic, Latino, whatever. But again, it's a challenge. Our leadership continues to call us to that. And I do serve on several boards, and often I'm the only person of color among them. It is improving, but that's a challenge. We're all aware of the changing demographics of our country. If nothing else brought it out, the past election really did. And no doubt that we will continue to divide the city and go into the neighborhoods and to serve the dear neighbor without distinction. But my belief, and I think the challenge that I think we still face, is to promote systemic change. Not serving fish, but teaching people how to fish. And racism, which largely affects people of color, mainly Latinos and African Americans, but also certainly others, and any of the isms that continue to oppress. We all know that the whole thing about the sexism that occurred and the disabled and all of that. But racism is a big flag, in my opinion, that is just still waving. And it's pervasive, and people thought because we had a biracial president that things had changed. Well, in my experience, the last few years they've told me how pervasive it is, and it's alive and well, and still kicking. It's evident in our church, in our educational system, many of our large urban areas. Public education is abominable. Our healthcare system, the disparities in care, the political system, that go through it all. And I am well aware, Sister Carol Ken, who is the director of the Catholic Health Association, it was largely due to her leadership and also to many women religious that the Affordable Health Care Bill was passed. And we know what they went through and what she went through and suffered through because of her support of that. And there's Sister Simone Campbell, social service sister, and what she did with this, get on the bus and pointing out all the inequities in the budget that was being put forth and how it would adversely affect the poor and vulnerable. So for me, this is a beacon of hope, because we see the potential that we have to promote change in systems that oppress. And that's what I'm calling for. And I've been highly recommending this book by Father Brian Madisonville. He's my prophet right now. He is a priest who is a faculty member at Marquette University in Milwaukee. He has his doctorate in theology. He's a very mild person, but very erudite. And I'm just going to make a couple of quotes from his book. And he was recently here for a workshop that I was unable to attend because I was not in town. But a group that I was with had him here about 4 years ago for a workshop on racism. And the attendance was not what I would like to have been, but it was nice. He says, and I really resonated with this book very much. If my Catholic faith has nothing significant to say about a social evil that impacts my life every day in ways both small and large, hidden and blatant, then I and millions of other Catholics of color are fools in wasting our time. I could go on quoting for days, but I won't. The other quote, the church's failure to engage adequately the pivotal issue of racism and justice decisively compromises its teaching of justice and renders its practices of justice ineffective. And sisters, we are the church. And I remember the 60s and 70s when we had many voices rising up and many people involved. And I'm not saying that everyone has to directly serve the African American community. We're not all called to that. But we're all called, I feel, to promote systemic change. St. Joseph Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. Yeah. And it's a history. And it was written in '99, and I went through it and I read it. And there's nothing in there here about the desegregation of the hospital in the early 60s. Now, I was there. Nothing. And again, it was, of course, I wrote the author, and I did contact the administrator then. She didn't have anything to do with the writing of it. But again, it's that omission. That's a very important part of my history. That was, I used to have to go into the patient's room and say, do you mind having a Negro in here for your...
Did you?
Yes. People, do you mind having... And I learned later that how you call when you make reservations to come to the hospital, that the person who would call and say, Mrs. So-and-so will have a bed for you to come, blah, blah, blah. Well, that person used to always have to ask, do you mind having a Negro as your roommate? No, that's past. But for me, that's an important part of our history. Is completely, and the people, with all due respect to the sisters whom they interviewed, they were not there during that time. But if you're going to be scholarly and do a history, let's get it right. And that's been the problem with a lot of our books. A lot of us have been omitted for our history.
What do you think being serious about racial justice in our own congregations would look like?
Well, I remember the time when we had, today, I think whatever we can do to promote systemic change. And there was a time when, and I can't think of it, but it was like we only purchased from companies that had diverse staffs and that served diverse communities. Several of our sisters, and I don't know individually, I know my being in healthcare, were very active. But some of our sisters really, and again, I do know that the contraceptive thing is a problem, which they're working out as far as healthcare. That's something we've been working in Catholic healthcare for years, is access for people who are poor and vulnerable. Cardinal Bernardin had written beautifully about that back in the 80s and what he's done. And so to let a whole thing fail, and then I call this, people that don't like it, and you can turn the camera off if you want to, pelvic politics. That's all we're interested in. There are more, when I say the hierarchical church, there are things that are as important as pelvic politics. And Father Massengill brings out in his book, no one talks about there's not a passion to eradicate racism. No one has a doubt about the official stance against abortion, which I'm against abortion too. Stem cell, is a little question in my mind about it. But we have to keep up. There's a new theology that hasn't kept up with science and all of this that I think we need to be aware of. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I think focusing in on systemic and speaking up. We used to speak up as a congregation in the 60s and 70s. I don't see that, and it's difficult to get everyone on the same ship because of our diversity, and people don't agree, but there are a large number of us who do have similar agreements that we can respond. The whole incivility that was going on in the election campaign, the Theological Institute that at the time Massengill was heading, they spoke up, they wrote. I wrote to Cardinal Dolan, did I hear from him? No. It's that, it's dismissed. So working on systemic change, and also any groups that we work with, don't do things for them, but help to move them into leadership positions. And if we are on boards, try to have inclusivity. So we will have varying opinions, and that's only going to help us to grow and be better, I think, because we are missing a great deal of talent and input because of people who are not at the table. They all look alike. And one of the things that Father Brian mentions, he's from Milwaukee, he grew up there, first college graduate in his family, and he's a young man. And occasionally he will still, at the parish where he was, he says the liturgy. Now, we have Rock Church here, and people go a lot because they want to experience the liturgy, which is fine. And a lot of that, I'm not for a lot of clapping and yelling and all that. I like good spiritual music. But at the end, he says, when he presides, he says, he welcomes people, glad they were there, and what did you like about it? A lot of them will mention, well, the liveliness, the clapping, the songs, and sometimes the good homily, because we know it's a dearth of that in some places. I won't generalize. And he says, now I would like for all of the gays to stand. I would like for this group to stand. I would like for this group to stand. So I can't remember, verbatim, it's in the book. And then he says, I would like for you to look around. And he said, this is the kingdom of heaven. He said, not many places will you experience this diversity. Because people go back to their own silos and that. They do not. Many places I go, I'm the only person of color. And this is for years. And I say 2-13. It's still the same. Something is wrong in light of demographics.
Could you talk more about North St. Louis and what that means? Because they've heard it a couple of times and no one has explained what that means.
Okay, look in the paper every morning. Usually there's someone who's been shot, and that's terrible. And I wrote a letter to the editor when I first came back to St. Louis because it was just, somebody else has been killed. Anyways, predominantly African American, although there are some people there of mixed race and Caucasians. They've done a lot as far as some of the housing they're trying to develop the community, but it's a blighted area. Now, I used to go up, they call it the Ville. I didn't even remember that when I lived here in St. Louis growing up. But we used to go up on, it was called East, and then it's called Martin Luther King Drive now. And usually in any major city, if you go up and down Martin Luther King Drive, it's in the middle of what they say the ghetto. But it is, it's a blighted area, it's a quite poor area. There are educated people there though. I mean, it's not, just one, but it's a challenge in that area. And as I said, Pat and Regina had ministered there for many years. Regina at St. Matthew's, and also at, used to be Homer Phillips, now it's a retirement facility for seniors, and Pat at St. Therese, and they'll tell you about their ministries there. But it's the violence and the guns and all of that. Does that help? Yeah.
Barbara, we are so So you see, I gave her the right adjectives. Maybe now we could give her a few more, right?
Why don't we take a 10-minute stretch break, bathroom, water, and then we'll have Roseanne Siebert.
And I want to say that you are in my prayers, and I